1942 was the Hinge of Fate, as Winston Churchill put it. It was the year that Axis powers stopped winning. 1942 marked the end of the sweeping, unstoppable victories that the Wehrmacht had performed in Poland, France, Russia, and many other countries. But the year began with the same earth-shattering, sweeping victories in the Soviet Union and North Africa. It looked as if the Germans were on the cusp of taking the oil fields in the Caucasus and marching on the Suez Canal in North Africa, right as the Japanese started their rampage throughout the Pacific. But on the strategic level, the Germans were already losing. They found themselves at war with the world's three largest powers, America, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. It was only a matter of time before the Allies brought their superiority to bear against the Germans. In 1940, the Germans realized that England was unconquerable and that peace with the Allies was impossible. While in the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the initial drive to Moscow failed. Despite capturing millions of Red Army prisoners, the Soviet people were still in the fight, willing to defend every inch of Russian soil. By 1942, the odds weren't in Germany's favor. But if there was any army and people that was used to fighting outnumbered, it was the Germans. The German military tradition that was forged by Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War demanded that wars be short and lively. Frederick the Great was able to win decisive victories despite being outnumbered by using crack troops. The Prussians, in effect, became the Spartans of Victorian Europe. Their elite training and formations became the envy of the world. They continued to shock everyone in the German Wars of Unification, Franco-Prussian War, and the opening days of the First World War. While the Western Front in World War I was deadlocked after the Battle of the Marne, the Eastern Front, on the other hand, was a place of rapid movement, encirclement, and maneuver. In short, the concept of being outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded on all sides was nothing new in German history. For 1942, the German High Command's plan was simple: regroup and try again, using the same tactics and strategy they always used. Blitzkrieg, or Bewegungskrieg, as it was really called, a war of rapid movement, breakthrough, and encirclement. But instead of taking Moscow, the plan was to head south, to take the oil in the Caucasus, before the German reserves ran dry, while forces in Africa raced to the Suez Canal. But this time, the battlefield was different. Instead of war being short and lively in the Frederick the Great sense, it was now a war of attrition. The Germans had lost already 1 million men so far in the war and were running desperately low on reserves. For these twin offensives, the Wehrmacht would be relying upon increasing numbers of foreign troops, i.e. the Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians, for support. These troops would have varying degrees of training and equipment, but would suffer the blunt of the enemy's defenses regardless. This is part 1 in a 3-part series based on Robert Centino's work on the collapse of the Wehrmacht. In the description below, there will be a link to his works. With enemies surrounded on all sides, the first order of business was to mop up loose ends from the last campaign in 1941. For any offensive move to be made beyond the Ukraine, they needed to secure Crimea. A German officer wrote, "Strong enemy formations on Crimea constitute a permanent threat to our rear." The Crimean campaign was the most interesting and unusual in the history of modern war. It features huge forces on both sides, cramped into a tiny, self-contained package. Erich von Manstein wrote that the Crimean campaign was a campaign which, in 10 months of incessant fighting, included both offensive and defensive battles, mobile warfare with full freedom of action. This is where we'll start, with the Battle of Crimea. But to talk about the Crimea campaign, we'll have to circle back to the summer of 41, the summer of disaster. Manstein was a growing star within the Wehrmacht for being one of the planners behind KSLL and for being one of the officers who devised the armored thrust through the Ardennes forest. In Operation Barbarossa, Manstein commanded panzers and Army Groups North's drive to Leningrad. When the drive to the city stalled, he was transferred south. This was the assignment he'd been waiting for, a chance to prove himself far from the prying eyes of the German High Command. Manstein's plan was simple: a swift breakthrough into the Crimea from the north with 2 infantry divisions acting as assault troops, followed by elite mountain divisions and the 1st SS Panzer Division to hammer through with breakthroughs. In reserve would be the 3rd Romanian Army. In support of the infantry was German heavy artillery and Stuka bombers. The crossing into Crimea would be nothing but flat terrain, which put the Germans at a severe disadvantage. They'd be running into Soviet fortifications that the Germans called the Tartar Wall, which was an elaborate series of trenches, bunkers, and houses connected together, blocking the Perekop Isthmus into Crimea. Defending the isthmus were 3 Soviet rifle divisions that were hastily conscripted, but backing the newly trained infantry was Soviet air power and tanks that were ordered by Stalin to defend Crimea at all costs. The German operation began on September 24th, 1941, and immediately ran into problems, with Manstein's panzers being suddenly transferred to the Dnieper, meaning that there would be no rapid breakthrough to support the troops on the ground. Despite the infantry smashing through the Tartar line, they couldn't follow up their victory due to the lack of tanks On top of that, more Soviet troops were in Crimea than expected, which was a massive intelligence failure. Germany's lack of emphasis on proper intelligence is one of the tropes we'll find throughout the video. On top of having no intelligence, the maps of the isthmus that the Germans had were outdated. One of the biggest obstacles the Germans faced in the opening stages of the campaign were the Finger Lakes in the region, which weren't on these outdated maps. The lakes made perfect bottlenecks for the Soviets to defend, but the Germans had experience in breaking through defensive fortifications. They faced them in France, Poland, and Greece. They understood that the only way to break through heavy forts was through small unit tactics akin to stormtroopers of World War I. But by December, the Germans managed to break through and pressed the city port of Sevastopol. They managed to take the high ground around the city and breach the two rings of Soviet defenses, but Soviet Marines managed to land just in time to save the city, halting the fall for only a couple more months. But while the Marines were holding the city to the last man, a whole new Soviet army managed to land right under Manstein's nose. Stalin landed 41,000 troops in the dead of winter on December 26 in the Kerch Peninsula in an attempt to drive the Nazis off Crimea. These landings were less like D-Day than one might think. There were no landing crafts, only rafts and barges. Basically anything that could float was sent to Crimea. When the Soviets came ashore, they didn't storm the beaches like Normandy. They mostly searched for warmth and huddled around makeshift fires. Out of the 10 Soviet landings, only 4 were immediately pushed into the sea. Regardless, Soviets managed to drive the one defending German division to retreat in sub-zero temperatures on foot back to friendly lines. The naval invasion was a bitter success, despite heavy casualties. For the moment, the Soviets had the advantage and pressed their luck on retaking the Crimea, but their offensive stalled thanks to the Luftwaffe. The Soviet counteroffensive in such close terrain failed to gain ground due to the effect of Stuka bombers. Any movement was quickly targeted and destroyed. With the Soviet offensive stalled, Manstein counterattacked and quickly crushed the Soviets with the help of his artillery superiority, panzers, and naval landings of his own. With the Crimea secure by May 1942, Manstein turned to retake Sevastopol, and with overwhelming superiority bearing down on the Russian defenders, the city was finally evacuated, leaving the population and the city's Jews to a horrid fate. Manstein had won, and for his efforts was promoted to field marshal on radio. Beyond Crimea, two armies lay in wait for the next move, the next breakthrough offensive. Stalin and his generals believed that the Germans planned on having another grab at Moscow, the railway center of the Soviet Union and the capital of the country. If taken, it would be a massive symbolic and logistical victory. To prevent this from happening, a Soviet army was then placed in front of the city. Hitler and the general staff, on the other hand, had a different opinion. They planned on moving south. Coal in the Donbass and oil in the Caucasus could keep the Germans at war with the Allies indefinitely. But resting in between the goal of world domination was the Izium salient, which protruded into the German lines like an arrow. The reason Elysium existed was due to it being a holdover from the Soviets' first counterattack after halting Operation Typhoon in the winter of 1941. The operation entailed splitting the Donetsk line. The offensive started in January 1942 with 3 Soviet armies crashing into the Germans, who were still reeling from the effects of the winter. The one takeaway Hitler took from Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia was that once one entered Russia, under no circumstances could they retreat. As a result, troops were ordered to dig in despite not having the proper supplies or clothing for the freezing Russian winter. The Soviet 6th, 57th, and 9th Army made short work of the Wehrmacht at first, who were fighting still in fixed positions. According to one German officer, the front was thawed out, incapable of maneuver, not outfitted for the winter, hungry and freezing. We had only one thing to throw against the enemy, our bravery, but by itself, it wasn't enough. By the 23rd, the Soviets managed to retake more than 50 miles of Russian soil. By the end of the month, the Soviets were 12 miles from the Dnieper River, but the offensive stalled out. The failure of the Soviet offensive was due to the limited mobility and poor supply. Soviet forces struggled to break through fixed German positions. These fixed troops managed to hold out long enough for panzers to reinforce the static Wehrmacht. On top of that, the Soviet offensive was so slow that panzers managed to smash into the south flank of Marshal Timoshenko's line during the offensive. By the end of the month, the offensive stalled, but the salient remained. Both sides in the following weeks prepared attacks around Kharkiv. The Soviets planned on widening the gap, while the Germans prepared to finish the encirclement. Both sides brought in around 500,000 troops for the upcoming battle, with Timoshenko striking first, surprising the Germans. But panzers managed to encircle the Soviet army outside the city of Kharkiv. By the end of May, the Soviets realized that disaster was on the cusp of happening, but Stalin and Timoshenko refused to withdraw. Timoshenko planned the offensive himself, and as a Soviet general especially, he tied his life to the fate of the battle. On top of knowing that he was about to be encircled, he committed 2 more divisions to support the obviously failed operation in an attempt to save it. Over 250,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, and the inevitable encirclement. It was a complete failure that further fueled the aggressive fighting of the German army. Despite the failure to take Moscow, the Germans were still good as they've always been. The winter setbacks were over, and the year of offensives and final victory, in their eyes, had just begun. Rommel has always been an enigma in the history of the Second World War. Upon his death in 1944, birthed the myth of the Desert Fox, the apolitical general who fought a clean fight in France and Egypt, a man who rose to greatness but became disgusted by the Nazi regime and plotted to kill Hitler. As a result, he was forced to commit suicide to spare his family the horrors of a concentration camp. This, as Robert Citino points out, couldn't be further from the truth. Rommel was a personal favorite of Hitler because both of them came from a working-class background. Hitler pushed Rommel to the top ranks of the Wehrmacht over the heads of sometimes better generals. Rommel was a skilled general, no one doubts that, but he was aggressive, sometimes too aggressive for the strategic situation the Afrika Korps found themselves in. Upon Rommel's landing in Africa in February 1941, he was given explicit orders from the German High Command and the Italian High Command not to attack. But Rommel defied orders and went on the offensive with a small army against green, static British troops. Rommel managed to run circles around the British army, defeating them in devastating flank attacks, which was textbook Prussian doctrine. Desert warfare to Rommel was pure maneuver warfare, which was the dream of any German commander, to have the ability to endlessly flank the enemy on nothing but flat terrain. During the height of the fighting, a German motorcycle patrol captured the two lost British generals that Rommel had been running circles around, General O'Connor and General Neame. Rommel moved over 600 miles in 2 weeks and only stopped to answer radio calls that told him to halt his offensive, which he promptly ignored. Rommel was used to defying orders. He had done it all throughout his own career and had never been punished for it. Instead, he was rewarded through medals and promotions. By the end of Rommel's offensive, he realized that the only thing left between taking Egypt was the stubborn fortress port of Tobruk. All attempts so far at taking Tobruk had failed. As Robert Citino put it, there was a giant fortress in his rear. Minefields, concentrated artillery, and stubborn Australians prevented Rommel from advancing. While the Desert Fox's offensive looked good on paper, he further isolated himself from the German High Command. Rommel managed to take over 600 miles of desert, but nothing was achieved. He couldn't go any further with Tobruk still in enemy hands, and he, at the moment, couldn't move forward. Chief of the German General Staff concluded that Rommel hasn't given us a clear report for days. I have the feeling something's wrong. All the comments I read in the office reports or in personal letters indicate that Rommel is in no way up to his leadership task. He storms around all day with formations strewn all over the place. He launches reconnaissance missions, fithers away his troops. Not one person has an overall view of the deployment of troops or their battle worthiness. Frederick Pallas then arrived in Africa to conduct a report for the general staff, and in his assessment, he stated that Rommel had simply gone insane. While Rommel was stuck, the British regrouped and started building their forces for an offensive to relieve Tobruk. On November 18th, British General Alan Cunningham launched Operation Crusader against Rommel. Cunningham's plan was simple: to bait Rommel in the open and fight a massive tank battle. But instead of fighting the now famous Afrika Korps, he faced Italians, who managed to pin the British long enough for Rommel to lure some of Cunningham's tanks into an ambush. The German tanks were able to quickly destroy the lightly armored American Stuart tanks, which the British had in abundance. After a few days of hard fighting, both sides suffered heavy casualties. Rommel managed to encircle some elements of British tanks, but they were able to escape due to the terrain. As Citino points out, under normal European conditions, encirclement meant blocking up perhaps 2 or 3 major roads. In the desert, it really did require 360-degree coverage, and no army of the day was capable of it, certainly not Rommel's already well-bloodied force. Despite most of the British escaping, Rommel viewed the battle as a victory. The Desert Fox planned on finishing the British in a grand encirclement once more, in what would be later known as the Dash to the Wire. Rommel planned on cutting the British off at the Egyptian border, which was covered in barbed wire, thus the name of the offensive. Rommel managed to gather every vehicle at his disposal and planned once more to encircle the British. In the offensive, Rommel managed to overrun a few headquarters, but nothing more. As a result, the British managed to, thanks to the help of the New Zealanders, relieve Tobruk. Rommel then decided to retreat and fight another day. While back in friendly lines, Rommel had some time to regroup. With Japan now in the war, British forces in Africa were sent to Asia to stop the collapse of their Asian colonies. Just like the year previous, the British were overextended and spread out. Rommel sensed weakness in the enemy lines, and once more, Rommel went on the offensive, with the Desert Fox finding himself only 35 miles from Tobruk, where both sides were locked in a stalemate. Just like in the Western Front, trench warfare ruled the day. Rommel decided to counter this trench warfare, and he focused his forces and attacked in his signature flanking movement, with German tanks smashing unexpectedly in the British rear due to the cover of a sandstorm. This caused a massive rout. With the British in full retreat outside of Tobruk, Rommel moved in to finally take it. By this point, in 1942, Tobruk had been stripped of most of its defenses, and only a small number of South Africans and Indians still defended the place. Rommel quickly overran the stripped fortress. The thorn in his side for the past year was finally secure. He was now free to finally move into Egypt. Rommel got orders from the German high command to stay put, while Germany and Italy focused their attention towards taking Malta. But anyone who knew Rommel knew he had no intention of standing still. Rommel decided to press the attack, despite being threatened by Albert Kesselring. If Rommel advanced, he would remove air support. Rommel ignored the threat and raced into Egypt. Ironically, Rommel's army was made up of captured British vehicles at this point. Around 85% of his army now used captured British equipment. This made it almost impossible for British pilots to make out friend or foe. So as Rommel raced ahead and outran his air cover, he saved himself by hiding in plain sight from British bombers. Rommel chased the British till they reached El Alamein, where the British decided to take a stand against the Afrika Korps. With the help of American Lend-Lease, the British now had better anti-tank weapons and armor that could penetrate Rommel's panzers. At El Alamein, Rommel became stuck as he tried to encircle the fort. The Desert Fox had finally come to his limit. British General Bernard Montgomery built up his forces and was finally able to beat Rommel at his own game of desert warfare at the Second Battle of El Alamein. With more troops, tanks, and supply, the dream of an Axis army marching on the Suez Canal was forever lost. Now we'll turn our attention east to Russia, where the Wehrmacht was planning its march to oblivion and defeat. The march to Stalingrad, as Citino points out, was one of the biggest intelligence failures in military history. The Wehrmacht estimated that the Soviets had 6,000 aircraft when they had in reality 21,000 planes at their disposal. The Germans believed that the Russians had only around 6,000 tanks when they had 24,000. And in terms of Soviet artillery, intelligence once again underestimated the Soviet artillery by a factor of 4. The Wehrmacht thought the Russians had 8,000 pieces, but in fact they had 33,000. These statistics showed that Hitler and the German high command had no idea what they were getting themselves into in 1941. They obviously grossly underestimated the Stalinist economy and America's industrial capacity and willingness to send aid to their allies. Casualties were also high. Over 1 million German troops had been killed since the invasion 9 months earlier. Thus, most of the class of 1923 had been called up, but only 250,000 troops joined, a mere fraction of what was needed for replacement levels. Desperately low on manpower, the Wehrmacht was now a lot younger army. Most of the troops marching to their doom at Stalingrad were kids, barely 18 years old, who were called up. The other half of troops that were called weren't German at all, but puppet allies. 10 Hungarian, 5 Romanian, and 6 Italian divisions filled vacant roles on the Eastern Front. These troops were poorly equipped and had varying degrees of training. The German high command had little interest in equipping and training most of these raw puppet troops, which is why most of the troops were of poor quality. The Wehrmacht was also missing equipment from everything from horses to trucks. Thus, the Wehrmacht turned into 2 armies. One army was focused around the Panzer, with all the best equipment the German Reich had to offer in those elite divisions, while most of the army, the infantry, moved on foot and used horses and wagons to transport their equipment. Instead of racing through enemy lines with tanks, they fought in static defenses. So why move to the Volga? Why race to the oil fields despite the odds being against them? Well, as one German officer put it, it was their last year that the Wehrmacht would be fighting on one front. It was their last chance to turn things around before the weight of the Allies was felt. The Wehrmacht felt they had no choice but to keep going. While Operation Blue, as it was called, started off on the wrong foot with a raw army, half made of kids and half made of puppet troops, offensive was plagued with logistical difficulties, plus Hitler taking personal control of the offensive, which enraged the general staff, who tried in vain to wrestle back control. The infighting at the top affected the troops on the ground. Mismatched orders and impossible timetables affected the effectiveness of the troops. The Sixth Army, despite being able to beat the Russians and get them to retreat deeper into the Russian heartland, weren't able to get a grand encirclement. The Soviets simply managed to retreat into the vast Russian steppe as the Germans became overstretched in hostile territory. With few tanks and limited supply, the Sixth Army had to stop several times and wait for more fuel. Tanks ran ahead of the infantry just in time for them to run out of gas and wait for the infantry to save them. While the infantry were tired from the endless marching and fighting, the whole thing became a colossal mess of starting and stopping. Intelligence of the area was limited, especially around the Caucasus. Most of the time, maps were decades out of date, and commanders simply relied on locals for knowledge of the terrain. Others simply used a compass. Air support was also limited, with a forever increasing Soviet air presence. It got much worse for the Wehrmacht once the army split in two to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus. Army Group A moved for the oil and managed to move deep into the Caucasus with a relatively small army, but the Army Group slowly started getting stripped of their air cover. once the Battle of Stalingrad truly began. Regardless, German panzers under Mackensen, the son of the great World War I general, was able to take Maikop, one of the main oil fields, but the fields were practically destroyed by the time they got there. German engineers stated it would take over 2 years to get the oil fields back online, while any historian would tell you that the Germans wouldn't last another couple months this deep in Russia. If you want to learn more about the Battle of the Caucasus, I made a detailed video of the campaign, and a link will be provided in the description. Now that I have your attention for the moment, and if you made it this far, please consider liking and subscribing and helping build the channel. The Germans managed to take most of the Caucasus but were forced to retreat after the Battle of Stalingrad, thus leaving the oil forever behind. Pallas reached Stalingrad despite being harassed the entire way by Soviet forces fighting a delaying action. He found himself in a tight position, overstretched, low on supply and material. He had no other choice but to fight his way into the city and try to take it, which in his view was the only chance of his army's survival. But Pallas, as Santino argued, can be considered as one of the worst generals of the 20th century. Stalingrad was the shape of a rectangle. It was long but thin. Instead of attacking straight down the middle, he attacked from bottom up, making the task of taking the city twice as hard. The battle, as you know, was one of the most important battles in human history. It seemed as if the fate of the world rested on the balance of the battle. The Germans raced into the city, fighting their way street to street, house to house, in a desperate attempt to take the city. The steel town, the size of Pittsburgh, became the focal point of both armies as reserve after reserve were thrown in. In an act of desperation, Pallas began stripping vital troops and air cover from the Caucasus, thus removing any chance of taking more oil fields. While Pallas's best troops fought their way into the city and took most of it, Italian and Romanian troops guarded the flanks of the city, poorly armed and poorly equipped. On the other side of the Volga, Soviet armies were preparing a massive counterattack that the foreign auxiliary troops could never counter. Finally, in November 1942, Operation Uranus began, and the fate of Stalingrad was sealed.